Thank you all so much for being here today, both in person and to our virtual watchers. My name is Katie Tawawa. I'm the Communications Manager for Life Powered. We are a national initiative of the Texas Public Policy Foundation with the mission of raising America's energy IQ. So we do that by educating policymakers and the public about the importance of affordable, reliable energy to human flourishing, both in Texas, in the nation, and around the world. This panel is titled Raising Texas's Energy IQ because, surprisingly enough, even though the Lone Star State is the top energy producing state in the country, our public education system focuses surprisingly little on either the science of or the careers of the energy industry, specifically oil and gas. So here to help us understand how we can address that gap are some experts I think you'll be excited to hear from. To my left, we have Laura Torres. She is an educational professional with 23 years of strategic leadership experience in program development, management, curriculum design, career and technical advising in secondary and public schools, and currently serves as the statewide CTE coordinator for the Texas Education Agency. Joining us virtually, we have Dr. Scott Tinker, the director of the 250-person Bureau of Economic Geology at the University of Texas, and also the founder of the nonprofit Switch Energy Alliance, which has released several excellent documentaries I highly recommend. And unfortunately, State Representative Brooks Landgraf was unavailable to join us today because session happens and he's still on the House floor debating some rules. But fortunately, we have one of TPPF's own experts here to fill in. Erin Valdez is our policy analyst for the Right on Work initiative. She is an expert on education and workforce policy, so we're excited to have her here today with us as well.
Thank you.
So to start things off, let's just set the stage. Could all three of y'all chime in on just the state of how education and the energy industry work together today? The average oil and gas job pays more than double the average private sector salary, and that holds true for both blue and white collar jobs. But kids these days often don't think of oil and gas when they're dreaming about what they want to be when they grow up in the same way they might about being a doctor or a lawyer or a veterinarian like I did. So just tell us why you think that is. Do you think it's because of lack of education about the availability and variety of energy jobs? Is it because of bias and how kids are being bombarded with this climate change doomsday rhetoric about how the world's going to end in 12 years? What do you think it is?
I'll start. I do feel like there is a significant challenge with the way that career and technical education programs are currently structured. In Texas, we have generally followed the national model with the career clusters. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with the national career cluster model, but there's 16 of them. It wasn't until the past 2 years we've decided to switch from that model and create our own energy cluster. So energy prior to that decision had no place to live in the career clusters. Maybe it lived a little under manufacturing, a little bit under ag, but there was no clear definition if I were a student where I was going to get this education from. So once we decided to create our own career cluster, which we did create a large advisory committee with different oil and gas companies and renewable, upstream, midstream, downstream, all walks of life to come together and advise us on this, as well as some university and some community college folks. We created an energy cluster with 3 programs of study, one of them focusing on exploration and production, the second one focusing on refining and chemical processes, and the third program of study has an emphasis on renewable energy that focuses on solar and wind, which was right for the state of Texas to only talk about mainly those two. But the skills that are taught in those courses are transferable to other jobs. I would just like to add that this is the implementation year. And then COVID hit. And so we will not know until January when what we call our fall reporting is done and cleaned up, how many districts we know actually had students enrolled in either one of those programs of study. And then we'll begin reporting out and begin doing the work that's necessary to make these programs robust. So you have caught us in our infancy in the creation of an energy cluster for the state of Texas. And ours looks very different from other states. Other states, if I've researched it, their focus is more on like energy power plants or being an electrician, things like that. Ours is really focused on oil and gas as well as renewable energy, but we are in the phase 1 of it. And I'm going to let my colleague take over.
So on this point, I think it's very interesting. You asked kind of why kids are not interested in the oil and gas maybe the way you'd think they would be given the pay rates. In October of 2019, some colleagues and I were invited down to Port Arthur to visit with the mayor there and some civic leaders and some business leaders and some school leaders and talk a little bit about, kind of some of the work we've done researching the mismatch between CTE programming and actual workforce, which is an area of interest of ours. And so we just wanted to kind of get community feedback and hear from folks. We heard a lot of different things on this very point. Part of it is, schools tend to, at least until very recently, had an emphasis on college for all. And because there were incentives that were structured so that was the way that they wanted to go, there were also lingering fears of tracking students, things of this nature, which are legitimate. But then there's also some pressure we heard that some folks who maybe worked in the oil and gas industry in the 60s and 70s and 80s maybe had a more negative perception of working in those industries that maybe doesn't hold true now, and we're passing that along to their students, their children and grandchildren. And so there was some sort of bias against it in that sense. But what we heard was that many people know that that's not true now. And so they're working really hard to change that perception. So I think it's multifaceted in terms of the answer to your question, but a lot of what we're trying to do is better inform students about the opportunities available to them in these kinds of jobs, and make sure that the school districts are also doing their part to be a conduit to help those students find those opportunities.
I'd like to add really quickly that with our state-weighted funding, districts have the ability to use those funds for their career and technical education courses as they choose. But with Perkins funding, there is a requirement under the new Perkins 5 that their programs must align to their regional local economy. Right. So we are hoping to see some of that change, and we've been providing really gentle guidance to school districts because this is really a challenging year. But they were required to complete something called the Comprehensive Local Needs Assessment before they even apply for their Perkins application. And so we're able to read that and review it and make sure that it actually matches with what they've done with their Perkins funding. And so it's been a tremendous amount of work for our department in order to review that, but we expect to correct some of that as well.
And Dr. Tinker, you work with students in energy a lot. What do you have to say on this topic?
Well, first, thanks for hosting this. I'm really glad to be here with you, and it's such an important conversation to have. I think we don't do it because we just take energy for granted. It's like air. Why would there be anything on air? In developed nations like the United States, we just take it for granted. Lights come on, we drive our cars, we fly when we want to, we have houses, food, all of it. And it's not that way in the rest of the world, most of the rest of the world. So I think the challenge is to begin to understand that energy isn't a right, it's really a precious commodity, and it's one that is extremely valuable. So when we start to think about it in those terms, then of course we'll understand it, and it underpins everything in our lives. Everything that you're wearing, everything that you ate for lunch today, any way you got there, the building around you, everything depends on energy. So with that kind of a conceptual reframing, we can really begin to have a raising of the energy IQ, or inspiring energy educated future, if you will. So that's when I left my day job at the University of Texas and your state geologist. I put on the goggles and I go in to the night job, and that's when we formed the 501c3 Switch Energy Alliance, and we're really trying to inspire that energy educated future with videos that are nonpartisan and objective and fun, so that kids can begin to see that energy affects so many different components of things, and there are a whole array of careers available in the energy field. So I'm very excited to hear from TEA that they're just in their infancy, love to work with you on this, and it's so important for Texas to lead.
Yeah, energy is definitely something that most of us take for granted as long as it works. You know, when the power goes out, then we have a problem and we don't know what to do. But like you said, that's not the case everywhere in the world. In your latest documentary, Switch On, which I highly recommend that all of y'all go watch, it's about an hour long, it's definitely worth your time. You talk a lot about how access to electricity helps lift developing countries out of poverty. There's so many really compelling stories about lives being transformed for the better, especially for women and girls. But in one scene, you talk with some people on the street in Vietnam about coal. coal. And they are just so incredibly proud that they now have access to this affordable, reliable energy, and they're just beaming when you ask them about it. For everyone on the panel, what do you think can be done at the policy level and the communications level to help American kids regain some of that pride in our energy resources that maybe we used to have but have kind of lost?
So I am a Gulf Coast kid. I grew up in the Houston area, actually Baytown, Texas, which is home to one of the largest chemical complexes. This is what we did when we knew the 19 plant expansions were coming several years ago. We established relationships with our education, with our economic development centers, our local chambers and West Chambers in East Harris County. We joined forces with community college, 7 school districts, and we were able to work with ECMA, the East Harris County Manufacturer Association, the Plant Managers Association, put together some funding, and there was a video made. It was something simply called Everything You Didn't Know That Was Under Your Feet, because the pipelines, the midstream things that happened in Chambers County. And so the kids were amazed. They took that for granted, exactly what we were just talking about. And we made sure it was a short video, catchy video, could catch kids' attention. I mean, originally it was 15 minutes. We had to chop it down to like 7 in order for it to be, something the kids would watch. We had town hall meetings that we hosted in conjunction with our chamber and our school district and the local community college. Is that scalable? I don't really know, but that's how we did it for our community, and that's how we received the buy-in from parents, because at times parents can be our biggest obstacle. Simply because I think they may have, there were downturns in the market and they felt burned by it. And so we had to reconvince parents and give them deep, information at the time that we were bringing in. 30% of the workforce was not from our community. They were having to bring people in, maybe even from other countries. And why can't those be our kids? These jobs should be for our kids. And then once we started speaking to parents, giving them that information, then we felt the tide begin to turn and enrollment began to increase. At the time, it was a dual enrollment program because we didn't have time to wait. The plant managers were like, we need these kiddos like now, how soon can you do it? So, I mean, as soon as they could get the TSI score ready by a junior year, they were already taking almost 14 hours of dual enrollment a semester to get them to where we needed to go. But we were doing it. But that's not really that doesn't answer your question for scalable for the state. I think we're going to need a group of collective minds to come together to find a solution.
So I haven't thought about this probably as deeply as you have, but one thing that just occurred to me off the top of my head when you asked that question, the question of pride, and I think part of it is, I don't think most Americans realize that, we're basically oil independent, or we're energy independent now. That was not the case in the early 90s when I was growing up. We used to rely a lot more on imports. And I think that's a message that's winning. I mean, it puts us in a great position geopolitically, Texas, itself and the nation. And I think that's a point of pride, and I think more people should know that.
Yeah, the United States actually just became a net energy exporter, which means we export more than we import,
right,
which is kind of the industry definition for energy independent last year. Yeah. So it's a very new accomplishment, and unfortunately a lot of people don't know about it.
Right.
If we can circle back to the energy cluster for just a second, and for those who aren't familiar, the clusters are kind of like a college major, but for high school, is that an accurate way to say it? Just a specialty area?
It's a specialized concentration of courses.
So now that we have this energy cluster, which not having it before was a huge obstacle because kids who wanted to go into energy and take energy classes were also having to learn about animal husbandry and other things that were not related to their topic of interest at all. Oh, hello. We'll take a pause to welcome Representative Brooks Landgraf. Thank you so much for joining us.
Sorry I'm late.
That's okay. We're so glad you could make it. We were just talking about the new energy cluster that is available in Texas high schools. And I was just going to ask, now that we have this cluster, what are the next steps? So it exists. It's out there. What more? Do we need more courses, more curriculum to fill it out? What's the next step to getting more Texas kids in these energy classes interested and fired up about oil and gas?
Absolutely. So the courses were just created, and we're actually having several more courses created as part of an innovative pathway. So the programs of study still have more courses to be created. But as we're doing that, we are going to need to start having the SBOE issue a proclamation or include us in a proclamation so that we can have textbooks. Because here we are wanting school districts to offer these courses, and literally what will they use? Because they have been dual enrollment programs for so long. So, I mean, you know, a student who may not have the TSI score to do dual credit might struggle to read a college, well, they will struggle to read a college level textbook. And why would we put them through that anyway? So we need curriculum, we need textbooks, we need professional development for these teachers, work on relationship with a professional development organization. And then here's going to be our largest challenge, and I'm not in any way pointing fingers at the industry, but you know, they have a significant challenge in providing a work-based learning opportunity for students that are still in high school. It could be fairly dangerous. And so what would that look like? We have about 3 years to come to a consensus about, will it be virtual reality? Will it be some kind of online mentoring? Will it be partnering somehow with local community college that have these plants on campus that just distill water and dye, and allowing the high school kids to come on and do some of these things there. But we have some time to figure it out, but that's definitely what we need to do. And at the same time, what kind of industrial-based certification is obtainable by a high school student? For now, the last committee said there were none. That usually the oil and gas companies want to hire the young person, and then they will get them trained up, and then they will make sure that they get the appropriate certification. That was the thought process 2.5 years ago. Is that still the thought process? And so if we could just come back and discuss those things, if we come to the same conclusion, by all means, but maybe there is some kind of entry-level certification, whether it's a safety, NCCR, or something that a student can get, you know, maybe OSHA, not entirely sure. But it's just worthy pulling together a committee of people to begin to have those conversations again.
So,
Katie, could I hop in here?
absolutely.
The voice behind you, Representative. You know, I want to make you aware of something pretty exciting. For the last 2 years, for this very reason, we developed something called Switch Classroom. 2 years in development, a platform to serve curriculum and videos online. The teacher is the administrator, and the students watch short videos, because candidly, books are sort of out. Okay, they land with a big thud to students today. They are video driven. And we worked with a network of teachers across the nation, high school AP environmental science teachers, for this energy curriculum. It meets the college testing board standards. There's quiz questions, short answer, multiple choice, etc. 5 energy themes. We rolled it out in August this year. We've already had over 1,000 teachers from all 50 states and 12 countries register, and over 5,000 students who are using it now in the first 4 months. We did a big poll, just got it back 2 days ago, on 32 different questions, and the content, the ease of use, the objectivity, because it actually looks at critically thinking about energy, the pros and cons of all forms of energy, oil and gas and coal and nuclear, as well as solar and wind and others, and some of the neat challenges there. So I'm excited. I really hope that Texas gets engaged here. We have on our teacher advisory council teachers from high schools in Texas, but it's something that I think is just going to launch and take off. We were 2 years ahead of COVID. We didn't know COVID was coming, but it turns out it's essentially designed to be able to flip a classroom and allow the teacher to assign this learning from our films from 17 different countries, site visits, expert interviews. You get all this real content, and then they can have discussions in class that are a lot more exciting than lectures. So Switch Classroom is here, and I want to make everybody aware of it.
Awesome, thank you so much. We definitely need more involvement from the private sector. You know, we are a free market think tank, and we believe that free market innovation and private charity and just Texans rolling up their sleeves and getting to work is often the best solution. So it's really cool to hear about that project. If I can get on my soapbox for just a minute, I also wanted to make sure those of y'all in the audience were aware, Life Powered actually has some new energy curriculum that's available for free to teachers in Texas. It's a course called Foundations of Energy. We currently have, I believe, 6 school districts teaching it right now, and we have free curriculum and free supplies for all of the course activities available to any teacher who wants to use it. There's some really cool activities, like you make a little Jell-O mold and learn how to frack using straws. So it's some really cool hands-on, science-based, unbiased curriculum. So that's available at our website, lifepowered.org, or can find me after if you want to see the direct link. But it's a really awesome program, and we're seeing some great success with kids these days. Learning more about energy, the science and the careers. So Representative Landgraf, what are you hearing from your district specifically? So everyone else on the panel here lives in the Austin area, but you're in the heart of the Permian, which is where the shale revolution has kind of transformed our state. What are you hearing from your constituents in the industry about how they're able to fill their jobs? Are they getting the workforce they need from our public schools? How is the situation out there?
Well, so the short answer is no, but let me begin by issuing 2 apologies to the group. First of all, sorry that I'm late. We just finished adopting rules on the House floor and rushed immediately over here. And then my second apology is that I saw this great panel and I probably should have just turned around and walked out, because I don't believe that I'm going to be able to add any value to what y'all have been able to provide.
Oh, that's not true at all.
I'm honored to be with you, but please accept my apology for my tardiness. As far as how this is being approached in the Permian Basin, so many of the families who live in the Permian Basin, are working within 1 or 2 degrees of separation from not only the oil field, although that's certainly our bread and butter, but we are also emerging with, being in the northern end of the Chihuahuan Desert. We also have plenty of wind and we have plenty of solar radiance, and so virtually every type of North American-based energy source can be found in that part of the state of Texas. And of course, so many of the jobs, as I mentioned earlier, are linked to the energy industry. And so we have a distinct advantage in that when you talk about a curriculum base that includes exercises related to how fracking works, that's something that's part of the parlance of most families in the Permian Basin, because mothers and fathers of these school children, live and work in that type of industry. And because things don't get lost in translation as much, it is a very useful learning tool. But how that translates into job preparedness, there is absolutely room for improvement there, in that we do have a tendency, and this is, to the extent that this is anybody's fault, it comes from policymakers at the state level, that we are putting virtually, to some degree, we're putting every student in Texas into some sort of cookie cutter mold with the way that we're evaluating their performance, and not really giving each individual school district the ability to narrowly tailor their curriculum to students, either based on what their experiences have been in life up to that point, or to where they're going in life. And so we have had some STEM-based schools that are experimenting with some of the projects, some of the hands-on projects that you've mentioned. Those have gone over very well with the students and with the teachers alike, even in the elementary grade levels. But I think that does help prepare for a better educated workforce, because a typical K through 12 education doesn't necessarily prepare someone for a job in the energy industry. And in the Permian Basin, there's a large number of jobs, particularly in the Odessa area, which is where I'm from, where we are the blue-collar backbone of the Permian Basin. And that's where the frontline workers, so to speak, are based. And there is a very high degree of technical expertise that's required to work in that sector of the industry, but not necessarily a college degree. So anything that we can do at the K through 12 level to prepare students to go to be part of that skilled workforce is going to produce wonderful dividends, not only for the Permian Basin, but as we continue to be the economic engine and the energy sector continues to be the economic backbone for the state, it's increasingly important that we have a prepared workforce, and that of course starts at every level of the education process.
If I could pick up on something that you, Ms. Torres, just mentioned, and Representative Landgraf here. The issue, I think, is about alignment of incentives. And so I think part of the issue is that school districts are often, they're offering what was popular 20 years ago because they've got it. And that there's nothing wrong with that inherently. It's just that things change and COVID showing us that more than ever. In the last session, House Bill 3 included something called the College Career and Military Readiness Bonus, which was a wonderful advance forward to rewarding schools based on outcomes for students. So that there's a bonus in there for students who enroll in college. There's a bonus in there for students who enlist in the military. There's a bonus in there for students who get an industry-based certificate and who pass the TSIA cut score, which is a college readiness cut score. And so one thing we've been thinking about is there a tweak here? So part of the issue is industry-based certifications, as you've mentioned, sometimes don't translate well to the high school level. Would there be a way to have an alternative indicator for career readiness? For instance, if 12 months after graduation, a student got a job in the industry, energy industry or any industry, above, say, the median wage, should the school district get it rewarded for that because they helped the student along on that path? My answer, I think, is yes, based on our research. And so I think there are ways, innovative ways within the policy framework that our lawmakers have put into place to better align the incentives of the school districts with those of the industries, whether that's in the energy industry or another one. So that's just one thought in terms of what we're talking about here.
Awesome. So we just jumped from Austin area to Odessa, and now let's jump outside of Texas for a second. Dr. Tinker, if you're still with us, you work with students in all over the country and even in other countries as well. Is there anything that you've observed in your work with the Switch Energy Alliance that other states are doing when it comes to energy education that maybe Texas should think about adopting as well?
Yeah, states and countries. I've been lucky. I've been in 65 countries around the world. And what I think I observe broadly is that Western Europe and the US have a perspective on energy that is really not shared by most of the rest of the world. You mentioned the group we visited in Vietnam. The rest of the world is just starting to get energy, just coming out of energy poverty. They're starting to emerge and industrialize and grow their economies, and they will have energy. It'll be coal, it'll be oil, and that's okay. As they grow wealth, they'll be able to diversify that energy portfolio. So education-wise, they're just learning how to educate. Many of them don't even have what we would call proper schools. Now, as you get into that middle range economy, depending again on where you are, energy is actually a positive thing. They take their kids off to conferences or forums when they come to their country, and they bus them there and they let them see energy professionals, as opposed to what we do in the United States and Western Europe, a little bit more demonizing of energy, for sure, unless it's a certain type of energy. So I think as you look across, we have to really begin to change that narrative and get away from this clean and dirty, good and bad idea. We all know that's not true. Yeah, there's a push toward carbon neutral, but I want to see us go toward nature neutral. And no form of energy is nature neutral. They all have environmental impacts. But the energy and the wealth that energy brings is what allows you to clean up that environment. And that's the message that needs to get out there. And it is in some states, and then quite differently, depending which coast you're on, what your kids are learning. And it's even different in the big cities. You know, your kids in Houston are learning clean and dirty, good and bad. I promise you they are, except maybe in the energy school, the energy high school. So we need to get that objective, nonpartisan, critical thinking and take the partisanship out of it. And I mean that. You know, oil and gas has impacts too. I was in the industry for 17 years before I came to UT 20 years ago, and it has environmental impacts. Let's not kid ourselves about that, but they're getting better in the wealthy nations because we can afford to regulate and clean those up. And that's the message that needs to be carried, is how you balance what concerns young people today, which is that environment, with the energy that makes and enriches all of our lives.
Yeah, and so few kids and adults today recognize how access to energy actually helps improve our environment, because when you are able to lift people out of poverty into prosperity, it frees up their time and their resources to work on higher things. If you remember in psychology class in high school or college, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you don't have food, water, and shelter, you're not going to be able to think about things like how clean your environment is. And when you are able to meet those needs, people have the time to do things like start businesses, get better educations, become civically involved. And that's really the key that energy holds for people in poverty, not only in the US, but around the world, is alleviating that poverty. There's an amazing video that UNICEF put together. As you can imagine, UNICEF and TPPF don't agree on everything, but it follows this young girl named Aisha. I believe she's from Ethiopia. Throughout her day, and she wakes up early, she takes her plastic jug of water and her camel, and she spends all day walking to this dirty, muddy river to get water and then walking back home. That's her entire day. Meanwhile, her brother's going to school. If it's a really stirring video, I would love for all of you to watch it. If Aisha and girls and boys and adults like her had access to things like coal that we vilify here in the United States, it would totally revolutionize her life. And I wish that was a bigger part of our energy-related curriculum. Unless any of y'all have anything else to chime in on, I think we'll circle back to Representative Landgraf for a second. So we have just launched the 87th legislative session, which is going to be a very different and very interesting session for sure, not only logistically, but policy-wise. So I know the budget's going to be a little bit tight, and people are going to be a little bit more focused on COVID than other issues that maybe they normally would be interested in. What are you hearing on the House floor from your colleagues? What are you planning on working on that might help provide some more and better energy education to young Texans this session?
Well, you're absolutely right that this is already shaping up to be a very unique session. And of course, for those who don't know, and I probably don't have to explain this to anybody in this room or who's watching online, but the Texas legislature is designed to prioritize issues, and really we work around consensus because we have a limited government structure that's designed to fit everything that is important enough to be addressed by the legislature during a session in a 140-day period every other year, but really that period's even more abbreviated than that, and certainly we're going to be working under every conceivable time constraint in 2021. So what that does is that forces us to have to focus on items that are of great importance. And you asked what some of my priorities are. I do have some very specific policy goals in mind, but broadly speaking, I think that we have to make sure that, look, we're a state, we're a country, we are a globe that is in some degree of crisis right now relative to what we're accustomed to. And I think that we have to use this legislative session to do everything that we can to stabilize the state, stabilize the economy, and do so in a way that does not shift the burden onto the taxpayers of Texas. We need to, as you know, the mantra here at TPPF, we need to let people prosper in a way that allows people to get back to work, but also in a way that doesn't add any financial burden to them. So that means that we have to make tough decisions when it comes to the budget, but I think that it also means that we have to do everything that we can to, within those budgetary constraints, protect the investments that have already been made in public education. You mentioned HB3. That's something that we were very proud to do in the 2019 legislative session. I think we have to do everything that we can to not inflict any harm on the progress that's been made. That's going to be difficult in this situation, but I'm of the opinion that that needs to be a priority, and we need to make those priorities, take care of those investments, but do so without raising taxes, because taxing Texans is not going to be the answer. But we also need to do everything that we can to not lose momentum on areas where we've had success in recent years. So prioritize education, don't raise taxes, and let's get people back to work.
Vance, again, our esteemed economist in the audience, is very happy you used his phrase, let people prosper.
Vance.
So something else we have kind of touched on but not directly addressed is this whole climate hysteria, Green New Deal, the world is ending. How much do you think that is impacting young Texans and the education they're getting and the opportunities they see for themselves? And how can we combat some of that with the positive, optimistic, hopeful view of the future that we maybe know is true, but other people who don't work in this weird policy bubble might not know? That's for anyone on the panel.
I'll kick in while they all think. I'll give you a quick story. I guest lecture a lot in universities around the world, and I was in class. It was a freshman, sophomore in college class for non-science majors on environmental studies. They had watched Switch and they had watched Switch On. And I go in and do an open Q&A for an hour and a half. Just ask me anything.
Wow.
And as we were getting about 2/3 of the way through it, one of the students, a sophomore in college, said, "Why does any of this matter? Humans are going to be gone in 15 years anyway." And I thought he was kidding. And I smiled and he says, "I'm not kidding." And I said to the class of about 50, I said, "How many think humanity will be gone in 15 years? About half the class raised their hand. By the way, this was a Texas university. This wasn't California or New York. Okay. Now that was depressing to me and shocking, but not surprising in some ways. The narrative that exists out there is going unchecked. And I think that when you describe things as an existential threat, that means a threat to our existence. And that's what kids are hearing. The narrative needs to be reframed. It can't be polarized like it is, because we've already seen where young people are going to lean if you create a polar set of choices. It's either clean or dirty. It's good or bad. It's climate change or denial of climate change as the words come forward. That's not the way science works. That's not the way anything works, the economy or anything else. So a reframing is highly possible, but it's going to take some compromise. I've written about this. I call it the radical, because it's kind of lonely. But taking energy and the economy and the environment and bringing those together, that overlap space, and really looking at the big challenges that exist in there, willing to look at data, willing to be a little bit wrong, willing to recognize, for example, because of COVID, we no longer export more oil than we import. We've lost 3 million barrels a day. Big stories out on that in the papers today. And so the conversations have to be dynamic, and they have to be very real to these kids, or they're going to they'll see through it in a way that they're really not seeing through anything other than what their own biases and social media have fed them. So there are great tools to do this, but you got to be willing to engage in that very objective space where all of our biases get challenged. I highly recommend one book, and then I'll stop here. It's not just what it says, but it's who said it that matters. So Michael Schellenberger's new book called Apocalypse Never. And Michael is an environmentalist, Times Hero of the Environment, worked in the Clinton and Obama administrations, a really smart guy, was a climate alarmist, self-described. When his daughter in middle school said, "Hey, Dad, we're all gone in about 15 years, he realized he had done his job too well. And he wrote a really thoughtful book, heavily referenced, 100 pages of detailed references about why alarmism hurts us all. New York Times bestseller, highly recommend you read it. And then let's begin to digest the messages in there and try to come together a little bit more on all sides of this issue, so that our young people aren't thinking they're facing an existential threat."
That should be the textbook.
Right.
I found it. Rest of the panel, anyone else have thoughts?
I will say this, I encountered this when I traveled representing the state at different conferences with other state legislators, and I think you're right, Doctor, that there is a narrative out there that really has been able to go unabated and unchecked. But I think one reason why that's been able to happen is that people view energy production and things like climate change or this notion that it's always dirty and always bad as some sort of abstraction that is completely separate from the reality. The reality is that most people who have these criticisms of different sources of energy also are consumers of those energy forms on a daily basis. Or you have a student at a Texas public university whose campus is in part funded by university lands oil production or oil and gas severance tax or things of that nature. And now, maybe that's our fault for not making or for not ensuring that those students are aware of those realities. But if we continue to not do that, then I think it makes it easier for some of these ideas to exist in the abstract without understanding or knowing what their real world implications are. And so I try to preach that message as much as I can when I'm, I am in a bubble when I'm in the Permian Basin, because most of us have a good understanding of that. But the farther away that you get from production centers, the less knowledge there does seem to be about that.
Yeah. Well, unless anyone has any closing thoughts, Brent, I believe, is telling me that we're running out of time, so I think it's about time to open it up to Q&A, unless y'all have any last things you'd like to chime in. Okay. Brent, do you have the microphone? No. Who has the microphone? Okay, there we go. We've got a mic in the back, so raise your hand if you have any questions for our awesome panelists. I see one over here. Hold on just a sec. And please, everyone, do make sure that your question is in fact a question. We would much appreciate that.
So I live in Midland next to Representative Landgrass District, and who has done a wonderful job as far as addressing some of these issues. But being there in the Permian and driving all over from there to Pecos and Monahans, Orla, everywhere in between, one of the big issues that I do see is that lack of trained people. So, for example, CDL licenses, things like that. We're having to bring in people talking to company owners from Cuba, from Mexico, and these are high-paying jobs that, some of these truck drivers are leaving jobs making $80,000 to make $100,000. So not just on the blue-collar side, but how can we also incentivize some of these operators or service companies to bring back internships? Because that's a big thing, too, that you don't really see anymore. Not just roughnecking on a rig, maybe in the 80s, but becoming an analyst or something like that on the finance side. So what are some of those incentives, or at least from a policy standpoint, that can be implemented? Thank you.
Love to take that, and I'd happy anybody else. We do actually have a bill we're supporting, just filed by Representative Theory on this very issue. It's a paid internship bill. It would use existing funds, so we're not talking about increasing our FISC in any way. Using the dedicated CTE dollars, which is 0.35 over the basic allotment. And it would allow school districts to partner with a nonprofit organization that matches students with jobs in their area that are paid internships. And so this bill got through the House last session. We'd love to see it get all the way across the finish line this session. We're very excited about it. We see exactly what you're seeing. Students need to have those hands-on experiences to really see the opportunities in front of them, whether those are blue-collar jobs, white-collar jobs, anything in between.
I just made a note of the theory bill that you talked about. But
fantastic.
But I
we'll
think,
talk more about it later.
that is a very good approach. And I think we also just have to, particularly for those of us in the Permian Basin, where it can be a very distinct reality that once you graduate from high school, if you do want to enter that sector of the workforce, I've always joked with folks that when I graduated from Permian High School in Odessa in 1999, rather than going to school at A&M and then on to law school, if I would have just gone to be an apprentice welder and become a good welder, I would make a hell of a lot more money doing that than I ever could have practicing law, particularly in a place like the Permian Basin. But we don't really promote that mindset. It certainly didn't happen when I was growing up, even in a place like the Permian Basin. But I think we have to broaden students' horizons, young people's horizons to those opportunities, because it's good for them. It could provide wonderful opportunities for them to provide for their families, but then it also strengthens the workforce, and in turn strengthens our ability to provide these tremendously valuable commodities for the rest of the world.
Awesome. Question over here.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
Quick question, and it's probably one that you won't have an answer for, but just to stimulate the discussion. And Scott knows about this because I shared it with him and Jason Isaac also. My son when he was in the 9th grade, he came home with a quiz sheet that was preparation for a test and showed me it. And the quiz went along the lines as follows. It said, climate is blank. And he filled in the blank. The teacher gave him the answers as they went through. And he said, changing. change is caused by blank, and it was burning of fossil fuels. The effects of the climate change are blank, and it was hurricanes, natural disasters, et cetera, or extreme weather, et cetera. And then the teacher said, why isn't it being addressed, the problem? And he wrote down, as the teacher said, because oil and gas executives make too much money. So I mean, it's apparent, I think, to everybody that's a parent that has children in K through 12 and even in college, that the education is very unbalanced. And as Alex Epstein would say, it's also very sloppy. Any thoughts as to why that is from your perspectives, and what can we do to address that?
But it's a very good question. I think and please, well, I'd love for everybody else to chime in, but I think the source of that obviously has to do with who's drafting the textbooks. Of course, Texas does play an outsized role in that, and the State Board of Education, who is specifically tasked with approving those types of textbooks and the curriculum, plays a critical role because Texas is such a large state. Many other states follow suit behind the type of textbook. So what we're talking about happening here is actually has influence beyond the borders of Texas. Now, I'm sure that there's plenty of room for improvement on how this is being approached at the State Board of Education, but I think it also goes back to the pervasiveness of this misconception about the role. So my wife and I have a 5-year-old daughter who's in kindergarten right now. Thankfully, I haven't seen an example as egregious as the one as you provided, but I am waiting to see. And as the doctor mentioned, everything is tablet based now, especially with with a pandemic style education. But I have not seen an exercise like the one that you talked about that says this iPad is made of blank, or is manufactured with blank. So again, it goes back to that disconnect between what the reality is and then what this abstract idea or this abstract evil is. And Bud,
I think part of the challenge is framing the questions differently. Mm-hmm. So I literally looked at every single question that went into Switch Classroom, and there were a lot over many, many months. But let me give you an example of how the essays, and this is for an AP environmental science class, and one of the most popular. 200,000 students a year take this in the United States every year. 5,000 teachers teach it. The question went 2 essays. On the AP test, one went like this: what are the environmental benefits of offshore wind? And the student would write those down. What are the environmental impacts of tar sands? And the student would write those down. So the question itself is framed to lead toward a positive and a negative impacts answer, as opposed to what are the pros and cons of offshore wind, or the upsides and downsides of oil sands, not tar sands. And so we have reframed the questions in all of these, and the students and the teachers are actually okay with it because they don't know. They're getting a set of biased things themselves throughout their lives, and you really have to begin to be willing and able to think more critically about these things and question more critically. And I think we are. We just have to get the right frame to do that and pull out all of our own biases. So again, I've known you a long time, and I'm excited to work with many in this room and others to lead this in Texas. But we're in 50, and it's because it's not a textbook. It didn't have to get approved by the TEA. It's just supplemental materials. But boy, do the teachers love it because they go online and there it is. And it passes the College Board standards, which we're helping to reframe as well, et cetera. So got to be a little bit more creative in, I think, how we approach providing the access to objective materials.
And it comes down to educating both the students and the teachers as well. Jason, our Life Power director, and I went to speak to a class about that same issue. And afterwards, the teacher was like, thank you. I had no idea about this information about, the U.S. being a world leader in environmental quality. That's a thing people have no idea about. And it's so important that we equip both our students and the teachers who are sharing this information with them, because a lot of times it's not necessarily that they're biased, it's just that they don't have the same information that we have.
And I would just like to add that cyclically, the TEA will review the Texas Essential Knowledge in Schools, we call them TEKS or TEKS, that are in each course. And there is usually a call out for volunteers to review these, and we really do seek the opinion of industry to help drive this discussion. But I will tell you, we're currently taking a look at, some computer science, cybersecurity, renewable energy, and I had very little industry volunteer their time to assist us with reviewing this. So we do need help.
I should know this as involved with Life Powered as I am, but I know a few years ago, Tom Lindsay had a committee that I was on regarding civics and government education in schools. And I think we tried to get a bill through, maybe got something passed, but at the same time, TPPF was sponsoring summer classes for teachers to learn more themselves about civics and government and take that back to the classroom. And I'm wondering, you had mentioned you and Jason, Katie, going into that classroom. Or is there any push towards having a summer school for science teachers that will expose them to this, so we have a couple of hundred of them that say, I'd never heard that?
I don't know that we've talked about that, but maybe now there is, because that's a great idea.
Well, I just think that's a great idea, and it's slapping myself sitting here thinking, why aren't we doing that?
Yeah,
because that's the holdup. That's what Bud's talking about, that's what Scott's talking about, reframing what's going on. And it's
There's
not going to
another
happen
tool.
if we don't do it.
Another tool that I think is really powerful, and again, it's the idea of competitions, case competitions. Kids love engaging in these. They love building a solar car. They love doing the kinds of things where they can compete. We had our first switch case competition this year. Because of COVID, it was a virtual international competition. We didn't know what to expect. And kids were going to look at 3 countries, pick one, and see how they would lift them out of energy poverty and economic poverty. Didn't know what to expect. We had 37 countries, 250 teams of 4 students each, from 140 universities sign up for this competition. There was a cash prize. It wasn't huge, but it was huge to them. But think about that, 1,000 kids, first time out of the chute from 37 countries, 200 volunteers, professional, mostly from industry, who mentored each team. Each team had a mentor and judged the competition. We had levels and top 25 and then the final 5. It was a big deal. This can be done at the high school level as well. It's not that hard given all the tools we have now. It can be done virtually. So just getting in and engaging with the kinds of things we're talking about now, real information, and have them study it. And their eyes open up and their teachers' eyes open up. So I think there's a lot of tools that are available now in the wealthy world. We got to remind ourselves we have electronics. Several of the teams in the case competition had to drop out. One was in Nigeria. Bullets were coming through their window of the students from the police during a student protest, peaceful protest. Several other teams dropped out because they couldn't keep the electricity on long enough to record a 10-minute video to submit it. So they were living in poverty and trying to do a study on energy poverty. It brought tears to your eyes. But this is a kind of tool that I think is so valuable and important, and now we can deploy these. Again, a little less rigorous in terms of vertical than we have been in the past.
Awesome, it's a great resource. I think we have time for one more question. Any last takers? Then I guess we will call it a day. Please help me thank our awesome panelists, Dr. Tinker, Laura, Aaron, Representative Landgraf. Thank you so much for being here.